November 1945. The
The
cold
war is
wind of the
over.
Rhineland
You are
swept through
free
the
to
aging
return
prisoner
home.
of war camp like a forgotten whisper of war. Barbed wire caught fragments of frost, and the skeletal remains of bombed buildings stood as silent
Welcome inside.
witnesses to a conflict that had finally ended, leaving behind only ruins and broken souls. In the dim barracks, German women huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the frigid air. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they had become prisoners of war nonetheless. Among them sat Helga Schneider, once a respected schoolteacher in Hamburg, now reduced to prisoner number 479. Her hands, which had once guided children through lessons in literature and history, now trembled from cold and malnutrition. Beside her, Marta Weber clutched a threadbare blanket around her shoulders. She had been a nurse at Berlin General Hospital, saving lives until the very end, until the Allies had swept through and declared all medical personnel complicit in the war effort. Her healing hands had not touched a patient in months, and the irony was not lost on her that she now needed healing herself. Across the narrow aisle sat Liesel Hoffmann, a factory worker from Stuttgart who had assembled aircraft parts, believing she was serving her country. The calloused palms that had worked 16-hour shifts now picked at the rough wool of her prison uniform, seeking any distraction from the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. The camp held nearly 300 women, all bearing the weight of defeat in different ways. Some maintained their dignity through rigid posture and clipped conversations. Others had retreated into themselves, staring at the wooden walls with vacant eyes. But hunger was the great equalizer. It mattered little whether one had been a professor or a seamstress, a mother of 5 or a young woman fresh from university. The daily ration of thin soup and moldy bread reduced them all to the same desperate state, counting hours between meals that never satisfied. Outside their barracks, American soldiers patrolled with rifles slung over their shoulders, their boots crunching against the frozen ground in measured cadence. To the German women, these men represented everything they had been taught to fear and hate. The enemy who had bombed their cities, killed their fathers and brothers, and now held them captive in this miserable place. When the soldiers passed by the windows, conversations would halt mid-sentence, and eyes would follow their movement with a mixture of resentment and apprehension. The women whispered among themselves in the darkness after lights out, sharing fragments of their former lives like precious currency. Helga spoke of her classroom, of the young faces that had looked up at her with trust and eagerness to learn. She wondered if her school still stood, if her students remembered their lessons about Goethe and Schiller. Marta recalled the sterile halls of the hospital, the satisfaction of setting a broken bone or easing a patient's pain. She dreamed of stethoscopes and clean white uniforms, of purposeful work that had meaning beyond survival. Liesel remembered the factory floor, the pride she had felt contributing to something larger than herself, even if that something had ultimately led to destruction and defeat. Sleep came in restless fragments, interrupted by the sounds of coughing, crying, and the occasional nightmare that brought war back into their dreams. Some mornings, they would wake to find that another woman had passed during the night, succumbing to illness or simply the accumulated weight of despair. The Americans would remove the body with clinical efficiency, and life in the camp would continue as if nothing had changed. Death had become as routine as the sunrise, another reminder that they existed at the mercy of their captors. The relentless cycle of days blended together in a haze of survival and monotony, each one marked only by the distribution of inadequate meals and the slow migration of shadows across the barracks floor. The daily ritual of food distribution became a ceremony of degradation that the women endured with whatever dignity they could preserve. At precisely 11 in the morning and 5 in the evening, they would form lines outside the mess hall, a converted storage building that reeked of mildew and desperation. The American cook, a heavy-set sergeant from Michigan named Roberts, ladled portions with mechanical precision, never making eye contact with the prisoners. The soup was a watery mixture of vegetables that had seen better days, occasionally blessed with a few grains of rice or barley that floated like islands in a sea of disappointment. The bread arrived in loaves so hard they could double as weapons, the crust blackened with mold that the women learned to scrape away with fingernails or the edges of their tin spoons. Marta, with her medical training, recognized the signs of malnutrition spreading through the camp like a slow plague. Hollow cheeks, brittle hair, the telltale swelling of ankles that spoke of bodies consuming themselves for survival. She had tried to speak to the camp commandant about the deteriorating conditions, but her broken English and his apparent indifference had made the conversation pointless. Winter deepened, and the barracks became a chorus of suffering. Women coughed throughout the night, their lungs struggling against the damp cold that seeped through every crack in the wooden walls. Liesel developed a fever that lasted for days, her body shaking with chills that no amount of shared blankets could warm. In her delirium, she spoke of home, of her mother's kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh bread and roasted pork, of Sunday dinners that had once seemed ordinary but now felt like glimpses of paradise lost. Helga found herself obsessing over memories of food in ways that shocked her intellectual sensibilities. She would lie awake constructing elaborate mental menus from her past. The Christmas stollen her grandmother had baked, thick with almonds and dusted with powdered sugar. The hearty sauerbraten that had simmered on the stove for hours, filling the house with the rich scent of marinated beef. The simple pleasure of butter melting on warm bread, a luxury that now seemed as distant as the moon. These fantasies became a form of torture, reminding her of everything she had lost while her stomach cramped with emptiness. The women rarely spoke of their families during daylight hours, as if mentioning loved ones might somehow endanger them further. But in the quiet moments before sleep, stories would emerge in whispers. Marta's husband had been killed at Stalingrad, and her two young sons were staying with her sister in Bavaria, if they were still alive. Helga's parents had died in an air raid, and she had no idea what had become of her younger brother, who had been drafted in the final months of the war. Liesel's family had fled their home as the Allies advanced, and she had not heard from them since. From beyond the barbed wire fence, tantalizing aromas would occasionally drift across the camp. The American soldiers ate in a mess tent not far from the prison barracks, and when the wind was right, the smell of frying bacon or roasting meat would torture the women with reminders of abundance just out of reach. They learned to identify the soldiers' meals by scent alone. Thursday was usually fried chicken, Sunday brought the rich aroma of pot roast, and breakfast consistently carried the promise of real coffee and eggs, cooked in actual butter. Some of the younger women would press their faces against the wire fence, watching the Americans eat with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The soldiers seemed oblivious to their audience, laughing and talking as they consumed portions that could have fed 3 German prisoners. The contrast was deliberate and cruel, or so it seemed to the women who had been reduced to counting grains of rice in their daily soup. Captain James Johnson arrived at the camp on a Tuesday morning in late November, his jeep splashing through puddles of half-frozen mud as he navigated the winding road that led to the prisoner compound. He was 32 years old, a farm boy from Iowa, who had found himself commanding a unit responsible for managing enemy civilians and prisoners of war. The assignment was not what he had envisioned when he enlisted, dreaming of glorious battles and heroic victories. Instead, he found himself overseeing the dreary administrative work of defeat, processing the human debris that war left in its wake. Johnson had been raised on values of fair play and Christian charity, ideals that sat uneasily with his current role as jailer to hundreds of defeated women. His first inspection of the camp facilities left him disturbed by what he witnessed. The living conditions were technically adequate according to military regulations, but they were far from humane. The women looked like scarecrows in their oversized prison uniforms, their eyes holding a hollow quality that spoke of hope systematically crushed. He observed the daily food distribution from a distance, noting how the prisoners approached the serving line with a desperate eagerness that reminded him of farm animals rushing toward a feeding trough. The comparison made him uncomfortable, and he found himself wondering about the lives these women had led before the war stripped away their identities and reduced them to numbers on a roster. Some were old enough to be his mother, others young enough to be his sisters. They were teachers and nurses, factory workers and shopkeepers, human beings who had found themselves on the wrong side of history through circumstances largely beyond their control. The American soldiers under Johnson's command had varying attitudes toward their charges. Some viewed the German women with outright hostility, seeing them as representatives of a regime that had brought death and destruction across Europe. Sergeant Michael O'Connor from Boston made no secret of his contempt, referring to the prisoners as jerry bitches and advocating for even harsher conditions. Others, particularly the younger soldiers who had seen less combat, displayed a grudging sympathy for the women's plight, though they kept such feelings to themselves to avoid accusations of being soft on the enemy. Johnson found himself studying the three women who seemed to serve as informal leaders within the prisoner population. Helga carried herself with a dignity that her circumstances could not quite erode, speaking careful English when necessary and maintaining order among the other women during the daily roll calls. Marta's medical background made her indispensable when prisoners fell ill, and the camp medic had begun consulting her unofficially about treatment options. Liesel was younger and more volatile, her anger at their situation sometimes bubbling over into heated arguments with other prisoners or shouted challenges at the guards. As November progressed and Thanksgiving approached, Johnson found himself thinking about the holiday traditions he had known since childhood. His family's farm in Iowa would be preparing for the annual feast, his mother already beginning preparations for the turkey that would feed 20 relatives gathered around her dining room table. The irony was not lost on him that he would be spending the holiday surrounded by people who had every reason to hate everything he represented, while the women under his supervision would be marking the day with the same meager rations they received every other day of the year. An idea began to form in his mind, one that seemed both deeply American and completely impractical given the circumstances. What if he could find a way to share the Thanksgiving tradition with these prisoners? The notion seemed absurd at first, but it continued to nag at him as he went about his daily responsibilities. He had read about similar gestures during the Civil War, when soldiers on opposing sides had shared tobacco and coffee during temporary truces. Perhaps there was precedent for extending humanity across the lines of conflict, even in the aftermath of a war that had been fought with unprecedented brutality. The announcement came during the morning roll call on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, delivered in Johnson's careful German by a translator who seemed as surprised by the message as the prisoners themselves. A select group of women would be invited to join the American officers for a special evening meal the following day. The invitation extended to 12 prisoners, chosen based on their conduct and their ability to speak some English. Helga, Marta, and Liesel were among those named, along with 9 other women who had distinguished themselves through cooperation and leadership within the camp. The initial reaction was stunned silence, followed by a buzz of confused conversation as the women tried to process what they had heard. Surely this was some form of humiliation disguised as generosity, a way to force them into a degrading performance for the amusement of their captors. The idea that the Americans might genuinely want to share a meal with German prisoners seemed too fantastic to believe, too contrary to everything they understood about the relationship between victors and vanquished. Helga's first instinct was to refuse the invitation outright. She had maintained her dignity through months of captivity by refusing to show gratitude for basic necessities that should have been provided as a matter of course. To accept what appeared to be charity from the enemy felt like a betrayal of her principles and her national identity. She had been raised to believe that Germans were a proud people who did not beg for scraps from foreign tables, even when those scraps might mean the difference between survival and starvation. Marta approached the situation with the practical mindset that had served her well as a nurse. Whatever the Americans' motivations, the invitation represented an opportunity for better nutrition at a time when many of the women were showing serious signs of malnutrition. If she could stomach the political implications, the meal might provide enough calories to help her regain some of the strength she had lost over the previous months. Her medical training told her that her body was beginning to consume muscle tissue for energy, a dangerous development that could have long-term consequences for her health. Liesel's reaction was the most volatile of the three. She paced the barracks like a caged animal, alternately raging about the insult implied by the invitation and fantasizing about the food that might be served. Her anger was complicated by a desperate hunger that had become the dominant feature of her existence. She dreamed about food constantly, and the possibility of a real meal, even one served by enemies, was almost too tempting to resist. The debate continued throughout the day, with opinions divided along generational and philosophical lines. Older women who had lived through the First World War counseled acceptance, arguing that survival required pragmatism and that maintaining pride was a luxury they could not afford in their current circumstances. Younger prisoners were more likely to view the invitation as a trap or an attempt to compromise their integrity through false kindness. By evening, the 12 invited women had reached various decisions about whether to participate. Some had definitely decided to refuse, while others remained torn between principle and practicality. The discussion continued in whispers after lights out, with each woman wrestling with the personal implications of sharing a meal with the enemy who had destroyed their country and altered their lives forever. The American soldiers assigned to prepare the Thanksgiving feast approached their task with a mixture of enthusiasm and bewilderment. Staff Sergeant William Murphy from Chicago had volunteered to serve as head cook, primarily because his mother had taught him the basics of holiday meal preparation before he shipped overseas. He had never cooked for enemy prisoners before, but he threw himself into the project with the same methodical dedication he applied to all his military duties. The menu was ambitious given their limited resources and the unconventional nature of the occasion. The centerpiece would be 2 large turkeys, obtained through trading favors with supply officers at other bases. Murphy had managed to procure real potatoes for mashing, sweet potatoes for a side dish, and even some cranberries that could be turned into a semblance of the traditional sauce. Bread would be fresh-baked rather than the stale military issue that usually accompanied meals, and there would be butter, actual butter, to spread on the warm loaves. The preparation required most of the day, with soldiers who had never considered themselves domestic taking turns peeling potatoes, seasoning the birds, and attempting to recreate dishes they remembered from their own family celebrations. Private Danny Rodriguez from New Mexico contributed knowledge of spice combinations learned from his grandmother, while Corporal Thomas Anderson from Minnesota offered expertise in bread making gained from working in his father's bakery before the war. The atmosphere in the American section of the camp was festive in a way that seemed almost surreal given their location and circumstances. Men who had spent the previous months managing a prison facility found themselves debating the proper temperature for roasting turkey and the best method for achieving smooth mashed potatoes. The mundane domestic tasks provided a welcome respite from the grim responsibilities of their assignment, and for a few hours, they could pretend they were simply preparing for a normal holiday celebration. Meanwhile, in the prisoner barracks, tension continued to build as the invited women grappled with their final decisions. Helga had spent the afternoon writing in a journal she had managed to keep hidden from the guards, trying to work through the moral implications of accepting American hospitality. Her words reflected the internal struggle between her political convictions and her human needs, a conflict that seemed to have no clear resolution. Marta busied herself with tending to the sick women in the barracks, using her medical knowledge to provide what comfort she could without proper supplies or medications. The work helped distract her from thoughts of the coming meal, though she found herself calculating the nutritional value of the foods that might be served and their potential impact on her deteriorating physical condition. Liesel sat by herself near a window, staring out at the American cooking preparations with an expression that mixed longing with resentment. She could smell the turkeys roasting, a rich aroma that made her mouth water involuntarily, and her stomach cramp with anticipation. The scent triggered memories of holiday meals from her childhood, when her family had gathered around a table laden with traditional German dishes that now seemed like fantasies from another lifetime. As evening approached, the 8 women who had ultimately decided to accept the invitation began what limited preparation they could manage. They washed as thoroughly as possible with cold water and harsh soap, attempting to make their prison uniforms look as presentable as circumstances allowed. There were no mirrors in the barracks, so they helped each other smooth down hair that had grown wild and unkempt during their months of captivity. The walk from the prisoner barracks to the American mess hall felt like a journey across enemy territory, even though the distance was less than 50 yards. 8 German women walked in a loose group, escorted by 2 soldiers who seemed as nervous as the prisoners themselves. The November evening was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in a sky that looked the same whether viewed from a prison camp or a family home in Iowa. The moment of crossing the threshold into the American dining area would remain etched in each woman's memory for the rest of her life. The contrast with their usual surroundings was overwhelming in its simplicity and warmth. Long wooden tables had been arranged in a rectangle and covered with clean white tablecloths that seemed to glow in the light of suspended electric bulbs. Place settings included real plates, rather than the tin cups and bowls used in the prisoner mess hall, and there were cloth napkins folded beside each setting. The visual impact was profound, but it was the aroma that truly overwhelmed their senses. The smell of properly cooked food, seasoned and prepared with care, filled the room like an embrace from a world they had almost forgotten existed. The scent of roasted turkey mingled with the earthy smell of mashed potatoes, the sweetness of glazed carrots, and the yeasty fragrance of fresh bread still warm from the oven. Captain Johnson stood near the head table, dressed in his cleanest uniform and looking almost as nervous as his guests. He had rehearsed a brief speech in German, though his pronunciation was clumsy and his vocabulary limited. The American soldiers who had prepared the meal stood along the walls, their usual military bearing softened by the unusual nature of the occasion. Some seemed curious about how the evening would unfold, while others appeared uncomfortable with the whole arrangement. Helga entered the room with her chin raised, determined to maintain her dignity regardless of what humiliation might await. She had decided to participate, not out of gratitude, but as an act of defiance, proof that German women could face any situation with courage and composure. The opulence of the setting, modest though it was by normal standards, struck her like a physical blow after months of deprivation. Marta's medical training kicked in as she observed the scene, noting details with professional objectivity even as her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. She cataloged the cleanliness of the environment, the apparent freshness of the food, and the body language of the Americans, trying to assess whether this was genuine hospitality or some form of elaborate psychological manipulation. Liesel simply stood and stared, her anger temporarily forgotten in the face of visual and olfactory abundance that her malnourished body craved with every fiber of its being. The teenage factory worker, who had once been proud of her contribution to the German war effort, found herself reduced to the most basic human needs: warmth, safety, and food prepared with something approaching love. Johnson cleared his throat and began his carefully prepared remarks, his German halting but sincere. He spoke of Thanksgiving as an American tradition of gratitude and sharing, an opportunity to acknowledge both abundance and the common humanity that transcended national boundaries. His words were simple, almost childlike in their directness, but they carried a weight of genuine intention that was difficult to dismiss as mere propaganda. The first course was soup, a rich turkey broth that bore no resemblance to the watery gruel served in the prisoner mess hall. The German women lifted their spoons with hands that trembled slightly, whether from weakness or emotion, they could not say. The first taste brought tears to several eyes, not just because of the flavor, but because of what it represented: acknowledgement of their humanity, recognition that they deserved something better than mere survival. As the main course was served, the portion sizes seemed almost obscene to women accustomed to counting individual grains of rice. Slices of turkey breast, golden brown and glistening with natural juices, were accompanied by mountains of fluffy mashed potatoes, green beans cooked until tender, and stuffing that carried the complex flavors of herbs and seasonings they had not tasted in years. The abundance was overwhelming, almost painful to contemplate after so many months of systematic deprivation. Marta was the first to break down completely, her professional composure crumbling as she took her first bite of turkey. The flavor triggered a cascade of memories from before the war, when holiday meals with her family had been annual celebrations of abundance and togetherness. She covered her face with her napkin, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from some deep well of accumulated grief and exhaustion. Her breakdown created a permission for others to express emotions they had been suppressing for months. Helga found herself weeping quietly as she chewed, the simple act of eating well-prepared food becoming a profound emotional experience that connected her to memories of home and family and normalcy that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Even Liesel, who had maintained her angry defiance throughout their captivity, felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she experienced flavors that reminded her of her mother's kitchen and Sunday dinners that had once seemed routine but now appeared miraculous in their remembered perfection. The American soldiers watched this display of emotion with their own mixture of feelings. Some seemed moved by the obvious gratitude and relief expressed by their former enemies. Others appeared uncomfortable with the raw human emotion on display, as if witnessing something too private for their observation. Captain Johnson found himself thinking about his own mother and the Thanksgiving meals of his childhood, wondering how he would react if their positions were reversed, and he was dependent on the charity of foreign soldiers for basic sustenance. As the meal progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Tentative conversations started between the Americans and their German guests, facilitated by those who spoke both languages and lubricated by the universal experience of sharing food. Johnson found himself seated next to Helga, attempting to explain American Thanksgiving traditions while she described German Christmas celebrations from her childhood. The conversation was stilted and limited by language barriers, but it represented the first non-administrative exchange between captor and prisoner since the camp had been established. Marta discovered that one of the young soldiers had grown up on a farm similar to the one where she had spent summers as a child, and they found common ground in discussing rural life and the rhythms of agricultural seasons. Liesel, initially suspicious of any attempt at friendliness, gradually relaxed as she realized that several of the Americans were not much older than she was, young men who had been swept up in events larger than themselves just as she had been. The transformation was gradual and incomplete, marked by long silences and moments of awkwardness as both sides struggled to reconcile their new circumstances with months of conditioning that had cast each other as enemies. But food has its own diplomatic power, and the simple act of sharing a meal began to humanize people who had existed as abstractions in each other's minds. The evening continued with additional courses that seemed to appear like magic from the American kitchen. There was pie, actual pie made with apples and a flaky crust that dissolved on the tongue like a promise of better times to come. Coffee, real coffee, not the bitter chicory substitute that had been their only hot beverage for months, was served in proper cups with cream and sugar available for those who wanted them. As the formal meal concluded, someone produced a harmonica and tentative music began to fill the room. The American soldiers sang traditional songs from their homeland, simple melodies that spoke of amber waves of grain and purple mountains' majesty. The German women listened with expressions that mixed curiosity with homesickness, recognizing in the music the same yearning for home that they felt in their own hearts. Gradually, the musical exchange became reciprocal. Helga began to hum a German folk song that she had taught to her students, a simple melody about coming home after long journeys. Other voices joined hers, creating a harmony that transcended language barriers and national boundaries. The sound was tentative at first, then growing stronger as both sides realized that music could communicate emotions that words could not adequately express. Liesel found herself singing a lullaby that her mother had crooned to her when she was small, a gentle song about stars watching over sleeping children. The melody was picked up by several of the Americans, who hummed along despite not understanding the words. In that moment, the distinctions between victor and vanquished seemed less important than the shared human experience of remembering home and family and the comfort of familiar traditions. The evening extended far beyond the planned duration of the meal, stretching into the late hours as both groups seemed reluctant to return to the normal relationships that govern their daily interactions. Captain Johnson found himself wondering how he would explain this extended social gathering to his superiors, but the concerns seemed less important than preserving the fragile sense of community that had emerged around the dinner tables. For the German women, the evening represented the first time since their capture that they had been treated as individuals rather than as representatives of a defeated enemy nation. They had been invited to share in an American tradition, included in a celebration that had nothing to do with politics or military necessity, and everything to do with basic human kindness and the acknowledgement of shared humanity. As the evening finally drew to a close, the 8 women prepared to return to their barracks with mixed emotions. They had experienced a glimpse of normalcy and human connection that made their return to the harsh realities of prison life more difficult to bear. At the same time, they carried with them the knowledge that even in the depths of defeat and captivity, moments of grace and unexpected kindness could still occur. The walk back to the prisoner compound was conducted in relative silence, each woman processing her own reactions to the evening's events. The November air was cold and sharp, a reminder that winter was deepening and that the warmth they had experienced was temporary and exceptional rather than a new normal. Behind them, lights still glowed in the American mess hall as soldiers cleaned up the remnants of their impromptu feast. The morning after Thanksgiving dawned gray and cold, with frost covering the barbed wire and wooden buildings of the prison camp. The routine resumed as if the previous evening had been a collective dream. Roll call at 7, breakfast of wheat coffee and hard bread at 8. Work assignments distributed according to the same arbitrary system that had governed their days for months. But something had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Helga sat on her narrow bunk and opened the journal she had managed to keep hidden throughout her imprisonment. Her handwriting was more careful than usual, as she tried to capture the complex emotions and experiences of the previous evening. She wrote about the texture of mashed potatoes on her tongue, the warmth of the dining room, and the unexpected kindness she had witnessed in the faces of men she had been taught to regard as monsters. Most surprising to her was her own reaction to the experience. The way her carefully maintained barriers of resentment and national pride had crumbled in the face of simple human decency. Her entry concluded with an observation that would have shocked her former colleagues and students. Last night, for the first time in months, I felt like a human being rather than a prisoner. Perhaps the capacity for kindness exists even in our enemies, or perhaps hunger and desperation had made me vulnerable to manipulation. I cannot say which is true, but I cannot forget the taste of that turkey or the sound of American voices singing songs that reminded me of home. Marta resumed her unofficial duties as camp medic with renewed energy, the calories and nutrients from the Thanksgiving meal having provided her with more physical strength than she had possessed in weeks. But her transformation went beyond the merely physical. She found herself viewing the American soldiers differently, seeing individuals rather than representatives of an occupying force. When the camp's medical officer consulted with her about a prisoner's condition, their conversation carried a note of professional respect that had been absent before. Liesel struggled more than the others with integrating the experience into her worldview. Her anger had been a source of strength during the darkest days of their captivity, and the unexpected kindness of their captors threatened to undermine the emotional framework that had helped her survive. She found herself caught between gratitude for the meal and resentment at having her preconceptions challenged in such a fundamental way. Captain Johnson filed his official report about the Thanksgiving dinner with careful attention to military language and protocol. He described the event as a successful exercise in prisoner management and cultural diplomacy, noting that the participating German women had shown improved cooperation and morale in the days following the meal. What he did not include in his report were his own reactions to the evening. The way the women's tears had affected him, his growing recognition of their individual humanity, and his increasing discomfort with the conditions in which they were being held. His personal letter to his wife in Iowa was more revealing. He wrote about the German schoolteacher who had reminded him of his own mother, the nurse whose medical knowledge impressed him, and the young factory worker whose anger seemed to mask a deep vulnerability. He described the sound of women weeping over turkey dinner and wondered aloud whether victory required maintaining such strict divisions between the victors and the vanquished. The other American soldiers processed the evening according to their own experiences and prejudices. Some dismissed it as a successful but unremarkable exercise in showing mercy to defeated enemies. Others found themselves questioning assumptions they had held about German civilians and their responsibility for the war's atrocities. A few began to view their prisoners as individuals with their own stories of loss and displacement rather than as a faceless mass of enemy nationals. The ripple effects of the Thanksgiving dinner extended beyond the immediate participants to the broader camp population. Word spread quickly among the German women about the meal and the treatment their representatives had received. Some viewed the chosen women with envy, resentful that they had been excluded from the feast. Others saw the dinner as a hopeful sign that conditions might improve for all the prisoners. A few dismissed the entire event as propaganda or manipulation designed to encourage cooperation with their captors. The conversation among the prisoners took on new dimensions as they debated the meaning and implications of American kindness. Was it genuine humanitarian concern, or was it a calculated attempt to undermine German solidarity and resistance? Could they accept such gestures without compromising their integrity as Germans and their loyalty to their homeland? Even a homeland that had led them into defeat and captivity? For Helga, Marta, and Liesel, the questions were deeply personal. Each had been forced to confront her own assumptions about Americans, about enemies, and about the nature of human kindness under extraordinary circumstances. The turkey dinner had been more than a meal. It had been a lesson in complexity, a reminder that even in the aftermath of total war, individual human beings retained the capacity for unexpected grace. As November turned to December and winter deepened its grip on the Rhineland, The memory of that Thanksgiving evening lingered in the camp like an unexpectedly warm ember. It did not change the fundamental realities of their situation. They remained prisoners of war, dependent on their captors for survival and subject to the arbitrary rules of military occupation. But it had planted seeds of possibility, suggestions that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings could choose to extend mercy and recognition across the chasms created by conflict and ideology. The three women would carry different lessons from that evening into their post-war lives. Helga would return to teaching with a broader understanding of human nature and a deeper appreciation for the small gestures that could restore dignity in degrading circumstances. Marta would resume her medical career with enhanced empathy for patients from all backgrounds, having learned that healing could come from unexpected sources. Liesel would struggle for years to reconcile her wartime experiences with her peacetime values. But she would never forget the lesson that enemies could sometimes reveal themselves to be human beings capable of kindness. Captain Johnson's report would become part of the historical record of prisoner of war management, a minor footnote in the vast administrative archive of post-war occupation. But for the individuals who had shared that meal, it represented something more significant, proof that even in the aftermath of humanity's greatest conflict, there remains space for the small miracles of human connection and the transformative power of breaking bread with strangers who might, under different circumstances, have been friends.